One of the things that a lot of new romance writers don't understand is that the plot is not the romance. The plot is not the couple going out for coffee and getting to know each other. The plot is what else is going on in their lives at the same time. And that is the problem that they're facing, the problem that brings them together, the problem that's going to change their lives.
Hey everyone, welcome to Let's Write Books. I'm Micah Craddy, the head of writing at Butterdocs, the perfect app for writing your novel, the app I'm using to write my novel, and you can learn more about it in the link below. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Leigh Michaels, a romance author, editor, writing coach, book coach, all the things that have to do with writing. She does it. Leigh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Micah. It's good to be here.
So Leigh, I'd love to get your thoughts on what kind of strategies you use to help the reader fall in love with your characters.
Well, romances are the best-selling genre that there is out there, has been for a long time. I think will continue to be. And one of the reasons for that is the emotional impact of the story and of the characters. One thing that we tend to do as we're writing is focus on the events, what's happening in the plot. And it's easy to forget about what's happening under the surface. What is this character feeling? And then to go beyond that a little bit, why is the character feeling that? Take a character who wants a big family, for instance, just to throw that example out there. A character who wants a big family, but why? Because I can think of about 6 different reasons. One of them is they're from a big and happy family. One of them is they're from a foster care background. They have no family. Then you get into the historicals that I write. Sometimes it's a matter of security. Having that family is a matter of as a way to gain security for life because there was no other way for a woman to make a living. So the why is as important as what the character's feeling. But I think that's what sets romance apart from other kinds of fiction is the focus on the emotions.
You know, I love that. I love the opposites you were talking about, how people can have the exact same
Yes.
motivation from different things or different motivation
For
from
totally different
the same.
reasons.
Yeah.
They can want the same thing, but for totally different
Yeah.
reasons.
You're either rejecting where you came from, you're accepting where you came, you want something else.
Mhm.
I think that's fantastic. I enjoy talking about genre because I feel like certain genres focus or heighten things, elements of writing, elements of books that aren't just exclusive to those genres. They contain lessons that can be applicable to other types of writing.
Mhm.
And so,
One of the things that's often said about romance is well, it's formulaic. It's
mm,
all the same. I've been asked, well, do you use a computer? That must make it much easier because all you have to do is change the names and the hair color. Well, yeah, not quite that way. But when we think about it, most genre fiction does have a formulaic structure to
mm.
it. And the trick is using that formula, breaking that formula sometimes in creative ways, but making sure that the reader has that wonderful experience at the end. I often compare romance to mysteries. Mysteries also have a formulaic structure. They have a problem. They have a character who's investigating that problem, and they have a happy ending. The solution is there. If it isn't solved, that's not going to be a very successful mystery. So, are all mysteries alike? Of course not. And all romances aren't alike either, even though they have somewhat that same structure. They have people, they have problems, they have a once in a lifetime love, and they have a happy ending.
So as a writer, do you find the structure liberating in some sense because it lets you focus on these different elements in a way, or does it ever feel constricting in terms of when
It
you're writing
doesn't
your book?
ever feel constricting to me because it doesn't get down to the page level or
Mm,
the first turning point has to be on page X. It doesn't ever get down to that point. But it's liberating in a sense to know that I need characters, I need a problem, and I usually start with the problem rather than
mm.
with the characters. And knowing that it's going to be a happy ending, that gives me the goal to write toward. Sometimes that happy ending is different than what I expected it to be because of the characters, but it always is a resolved and satisfying happy ending.
That's awesome. So you kind of got into a little bit about my next question was going to be, which is where you start when you're developing a
Mhm.
romance novel. You said you start with the problem.
I start with the problem.
What kind of problem?
Well, take one particular instance. I ran across a short piece in a newspaper about an attorney up in Wisconsin who was being disbarred because he had been filing his paperwork in the Dominican Republic instead of in Wisconsin. And his clients were finding out why. I have no idea. And his clients were finding out sometimes years after the fact that their divorces were indeed not divorces. So this is an intriguing problem. But then the next step is, who would this really be a problem for? And in that case, I had several choices. I had the couple who married, got divorced, and now this brings them back together. Or I have the couple who has moved on to other things, and this sudden problem coming up creates all kinds of conflict in their new relationship. So there's all different ways you can approach this one problem and come up with several different stories.
That's just funny because I was thinking about like obviously, okay, two clients who are like in a class action lawsuit against the lawyer who are both find out they're still married.
And
They
that would
fall in
be
love.
another good one, and they
Yeah.
fall in love.
And yeah, that's fun. That's a fun spark you could take.
It's a fun start. Yeah, and so I started out with a couple who had been married, and this brings them back together. And then you have all kinds of issues about, well, why didn't what if it was his attorney, why didn't her attorney figure this out? Well, they were very young, they were very poor, they used one attorney. You have to deal with those plot holes, and how can I make it realistic? How can I make it believable that this actually could happen?
Mm. Is there something about those problems at a deeper level, certain kinds of problems that are good versus for a romance versus aren't good for a romance or a novel in general?
Well, I think we need to keep our characters heroic. And
Mm,
that doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean ideal. It doesn't mean that they're better than other people, but they need to, in some sense, be larger than life. In romance, that means our main characters have to be likable. That isn't true with all fiction, but there needs to be something about any character in fiction that makes them worth the reader's time,
mm.
that makes them more so than other kinds of people, because of the stricture in romance there that the characters have to be likable. Then it really can't be, he's had an affair, and they've broken up over that. It would be difficult to pull that off. Let me put it that way.
I feel like that's so often the answer in writing advice. Well, you can do it, but it's hard.
I like to talk about the rules being, principles rather than rules, but there are reasons for these rules of thumb. And if you understand the reason behind it, then you can break it in a creative way. It's
Mm.
when people break rules without bothering to think about them, or why does a romance have a happy ending? I get that question all the time. Isn't that boring? They're all happy endings. But if you think about why they have a happy ending, then you can work with that and sometimes break the rule in creative ways.
So you mentioned happy endings and likable protagonists as two elements
Of the
of romance.
successful romance. Yeah.
Yeah. So how important are, I don't know if would you think of them as tropes or reader expectations when writing a romance novel, and like how much are you thinking about those during the writing process?
Sometimes more than others. Sometimes, after I finished a book, then I go back and think, "Oh, well, this was a Cinderella story," or, "Oh, this was a Beauty and the Beast story." Uh, Often I'm not thinking about that at the time that I'm writing, because I'm just writing about people and letting them do their thing. Tropes are out there and are important, but I think tropes can easily become cliches.
Hmm.
And it's very important to step back from that trope and say, what would my characters do? What would my characters think? What would my characters say? Rather than just following the trope um,
Yeah.
religiously.
No, it's so. One of the things I love about talking about writing is how interconnected everything is, and you
Mhm.
talk about one thing and you end up talking about another, and I find
Mhm.
myself particularly in every conversation, the answer or discussion always ends up being about the character at
Yes,
some level because
it is.
that's the heart of everything. That's just really what we're doing here. Are there certain golden rules though, other than likable protagonist, happy endings? Are there like maybe we'd call table stakes, or like you need to have these kind of just to build off of?
The problem that they're dealing with needs to be important to the characters, and it also needs to be something that the reader can appreciate and feel, if I was in that spot, I would be upset too.
Mm,
So, that depends on what the character is. Some characters have been out of shape about things that other people wouldn't mind at all. So, I always like to look for not only what the problem is, but why is it so important to this character? Why is this character willing to invest time and energy in dealing with this? And how is this problem going to change the rest of this person's life? Because unless it is a life changing problem, then is it worth the reader's time?
Mm.
I can't say it wouldn't be, but it's much more difficult to make it valuable to the reader if they're not on the edge of their seats thinking about what would I do if this was, what would I do if I found out my divorce wasn't final 5 years after the fact? That this is a really important question.
Yeah,
The
that
other thing I think about romance that we all need is the once in a lifetime love. That
mm.
even if this person has been in love before, that this is the best, best possible perfect relationship for this person.
You mentioned you don't go down to like the page level, this happens on this page,
Um,
etc. But are there certain beats you want to hit along the way? Do you have a certain structure that you find yourself going back to it again and again? Or how do you start putting your story structure together?
Well, I have been known to write the first chapter 13 different times and then come back to the very first one that I tried. So, thinking about how do I bring the reader into this story? What's the reader's window into this story? And how can I make the reader care from the very first page? So that's important because I only have a little bit of time to grab that reader. There are many,
Mm.
many romances out there. Why should she read this one? What is there about this one that's going to draw her in and intrigue her? And it needs to be characters that rise up off the page from that very first paragraph. And then I usually have a point toward the end, 5, 10,000 words before the projected end of the story, that is the realization of why this is so important. And then from there on, it's an untangling of everything that I've created in the first 9/10 of the book, to get that satisfying ending. And the satisfying ending is a lot more than on the last page saying, "Oh, is that what you meant? Oh, if that's what you meant, then we're all okay." It takes some time and some effort to build that problem, and it also takes some time and some effort to untangle it so that we really can be satisfied with the ending.
Yeah.
One of my editors called it, by this time the reader wants to wallow in the satisfying ending.
Sounds like writing romances and mysteries share a lot of puzzle-like common traits. How do you make sure that the story surprises people?
That's a very interesting point. And yes, writing romances and writing mysteries do share a lot of puzzle-like common traits. I make sure that the story surprises people by letting the characters rise up and do what they would do, and sometimes that surprises even me. There are things that my characters do and things that my characters will not do that I want them to, that end up being very surprising. So if I've created a character who is realistic, who is real enough to have multiple dimensions, then that character will do and say things that sometimes I don't expect. And I have been known to push myself back from the computer and say, "Oh, the phone just rang, and and I don't know who's calling, so I need to go for a walk and figure out who would be calling."
What is your strategy for taking walks for when you need inspiration, when you need to solve a problem? I feel like writers are always curious about how what techniques other writers use.
Taking walks, playing solitaire with real cards rather than on the computer screen, kneading bread, pulling weeds, anything that occupies my hands and the top level of my mind without going too deep.
That's
And without causing too much attention. I can't think about it while I watch TV or anything of that sort, but something that keeps my hands occupied. I knit,
mm,
for instance, and that's a kind of a zen experience because it's repetitive, and that lets me think. It lets my subconscious work
that's
while
fantastic.
everything else is
One
busy.
of my things that it's a strange is like staring out the window of a car or
Yes.
any or a train or a bus or
Mhm.
anything like that.
Yep.
For me, just I think it was, and I think that just goes back to childhood. Like I was a fifth kid, and so we drove everywhere. We had a big family, and
Mhm.
we didn't fly, and so I just spent so many hours stuck in the van. And this was pre iPad, so there was
Ah,
no entertainment devices, and so I just ended up just staring out windows for hours and hours.
thinking. Yeah.
And it was hypnotic in a sense that you
Mhm.
just kind of let your brain go free. So it's
Mhm.
like anything I can do to kind of get to that trance-like state
Yes.
is very very helpful. So I want to just touch back in on characters
Yeah.
because they are so important. You mentioned that they have a problem. You mentioned that they're likable. What kind of characters work well in romance novels? What are their attributes? And how do you start building those characters? How do you develop the characters into who they become?
Because they need to be not perfect, but likable. I think of the heroine in the romance novel, who is generally the main character, the single central character, as being someone, would I want to be friends with this woman? So that means she may have a snarky sense of humor, but she isn't cruel. She isn't
Mm.
rude. She's pleasant. But she also doesn't pull any punches. She's direct. And the hero of that romance novel needs to be somebody that I could see myself falling in love with. And that takes a lot more than just being hot and being handsome and being rich. So would I want to hang out with this person? Would I want to have breakfast with this person every day for the rest of my life? Somebody once said to me, and it was a charming thing to say. She said, "Leigh, you write such marriageable men." and, and I treasure that compliment. And that's what I strive for. Is this a marriageable man? Is this somebody who's in it for the long haul? Is it somebody that I can trust for years to have my back, to have my best interests?
How do you decide the spiciness level um, of a book?
Again, it depends on the characters. Depends on what is appropriate for them, what their previous experience is, what their life interest is, what do they have, their educational level, all these things about them. What is appropriate for this character at this time with this other person? And sometimes that matters, where the story is set. If you have a couple that are stuck on a desert island, that's a whole different level of heat potential than it is if they're visiting family for Christmas and they're sleeping in the guest room and their kids next door.
Mm.
You know, so it depends very much on the character, what's appropriate for them and their lives, and then what's appropriate for the setting and the circumstances.
How much should that be upfront to the reader when the reader picks the book up off of a shelf, based on where it's organized on Amazon or in the bookstore? I guess I'm asking, it's like, is it, this genre
Should
has
it
this
yeah,
level?
should it have an X rating on it? Yeah, I think it's wise to say to the reader up front in the blurb or in the support materials, in the documentation, that this is a very explicit book, or
Mm.
this is a sweet traditional, or this is a closed door where there may be things going on, but we don't see the explicit descriptions of what's going on.
And with those genres and the proliferation, I mean, you mentioned that you kind of classical female heroine, marriageable man, but also like these days there are
There are
so.
many, many, yes. My original definition that I use for romances is a man and a woman who, in the course of solving a problem, discovered that theirs is a once in a lifetime love leading to a happy ending. Well, then you go with the LGBTQ, two people. Okay, but if I say two people, then that leaves out menage, which is three or more, and it leaves out reverse harem, which is any number. If I say humans, then that leaves out the cyborg romances that have started up, and the alien male, human female stories. And where does artificial intelligence come in? And what about angels and witches? So I've kind of just said, okay, you really can't create a definition here that covers everything, but the principles are the same. Interesting characters, an interesting problem, a once in a lifetime love, and a satisfying happy ending.
I'm curious in terms of the plot itself. How do you build the other storylines, the other things that are going on in your characters' lives, other than the potential romance?
Honestly, one of the things that a lot of new romance writers don't understand is that the plot is not the romance. The plot is not the couple going out for coffee and getting to know each other. The plot is what else is going on in their lives at the same time. And that is the problem that they're facing, the problem that brings them together, the problem that's going to change their lives. So, that problem that we're dealing with has to intimately involve both of these characters, or this
Hmm.
cast of several if we're talking about reverse harem. But it has to closely involve the main characters, both of them. It can't just be problems that she has and problems that he has. It has to be problems that bring them together,
Hmm.
create tension between them, and for them both as a couple.
What kind of problems are you presenting your characters along the way as they head towards the resolution?
Once I find that basic core problem, then how does that problem get worse?
Mm,
How can I put pressure on this couple to make this problem more complicated, more stressful, more this and that? The problem of the divorce attorney that was filing his paperwork wrong, and so my characters ended up finding out they were not divorced. That is extra complicated because my hero is in the process of selling his business. That's how he discovered that the divorce wasn't final. And so that complicates his life in how he's going to sell this business. He comes back to her and says, I really need, because this person who's trying to buy his business also wants a relationship with him, is I really want to present myself as married.
mm.
I really want to sell the business to her, but I don't want her thinking that she's going to get me too. And so the heroine says, "Sure, I'll do that if," there's always a and, but. There's always an if. She works for a college. She's trying to raise funds for a convention center and events center, and she says, "Sure, I'll do it if in 90 days, when you sell that company, you pay me $10 million towards the events center." So, then we have tension on both sides. We also have a good reason for them not to quite trust each other.
Laura is asking, do we need to present the main characters in the first chapters, or we can leave them anonymous until 1/3 of the book?
Well, that will depend on what you're writing. If you're writing literary fiction, you may be able to pull off an anonymous narrator, an anonymous main character. But in general, the main character needs to appear. The single main character needs to appear first
Mm,
and needs to appear very early in the book. Not
gotcha.
necessarily on page one, but pretty close to that. The first character that the reader meets, the reader believes is the main character. And so if you're not doing that, it needs to be for a really good reason.
Do you ever write romances where the characters are already together, or is it always necessarily the story of a couple getting together or back together? There's a little more context I ask because in TV writing, I always find that whenever a will they or won't they couple finally gets together,
Well,
the
Blue?
writing really falls off, which may be answering the question here. It's in the question. Wondering if it's possible to keep that tension going.
Yeah, Moonlighting was a great series until they got together. Bones was a great series until they got together. And then the sensual tension just vanished,
Mm.
and it was very difficult to get that. So my thinking on that question for me is that I don't think I could do a couple who was together because, well, unless they're together for the wrong reasons. I actually have done a couple of books now that I think about it, a couple where they are married, but for one reason or another, this has not been a successful marriage.
Mm.
One of them is actually called The Perfect Divorce. The couple is in the process of divorcing, and then, oops, she's pregnant. And so, that forces them to try to work things out. It isn't a happy situation to begin with, because if they really were happy to begin with, then they should be able to solve the problems.
What is a happy ending? And then as a second one,
Great
how do you
question.
create a satisfying one?
Great question. A happy ending in romance depends on the kind of romance. It depends on the subgenre. If it is young adult or new adult with young characters, chick lit as it used to be called, then it can be a happy for now ending, which means that the couple is together. They are contented with the situation, but they may not always be a couple. They may grow in different directions. They may, but for right now, they are happy. So that is a happy ending. That is a satisfying ending, but we don't know what might happen down the road. The happy ever after ending, of course, is our couple is together. They've worked out all their issues, and we are confident that this couple will be together forever. That they have learned to communicate so that when they hit the bumps in the road, they will be able to deal with those and move on, and that they will always be each other's true love. So either of those, the happy for now or the happy ever after, is a workable solution for the romance novel. What makes it satisfying is that this is believable for this couple at this time. that they have indeed worked out their issues. So if your problem is just really a miscommunication and at the end is, "Oh, that's what you meant. Oh, okay, then we're okay." That's not very satisfying. It's a happy ending, but it's not a satisfying ending. They haven't really worked for this and they haven't really learned much. When they have a real problem that they have to cooperate to solve or they have to compromise to get along, then we're ready to believe that they can be happy forever after.
Leigh, do you think there are strategies or lessons from romance novels that would be helpful for writing literary fiction, mystery,
Mhm.
or sci-fi,
Yeah.
fantasy, or any other genre?
Yeah,
Of
absolutely.
writing?
One of them is the focus on emotion,
Mm.
that what the reader is feeling or what the writer's what the character is feeling is as important as what's going on. And we do tend to get focused on the events of the plot and forget to share what is going on inside that character at the time. So the focus on emotion is one of them. The focus on communication, on real people, heroic characters that we can care about. And in a literary novel, that may not be a great guy like we have in romance, but it's still a larger than life character that even if we hate, we can really understand and get into and share what's going on with that character.
How do dynamics work with two characters who are each miles above the other or miles apart in some specific way unique to them? How can they accept each other for who they are? And more importantly, what drives each other to go the extra mile to come together when they're so different?
I think that comes back to the problem that affects them both and requires them to spend time together, enough time to realize that even though they're different, they are the fitting pieces, like the jigsaw puzzle, that just fit together perfectly. But, when people are very different than we are, we do tend to avoid or at least keep our distance in some sense from that and not get too intimately involved unless there's a reason that we have to.
Hmm.
So that often in the romance we call the force. What keeps these people if they don't get along and they don't particularly like each other, even if they're somewhat physically attracted. But if they're not getting along, why don't they just walk away from each other? And that is the reason behind the book. That is the thing that makes the book work, is why they cannot walk away from each other. If your characters can walk away from each other, then, why don't they?
That's great. So you force them into this crucible,
Force them into something that they must deal with each other. And then
and
as
that
they do that, they learn enough about each other to say, "Oh, the first impression I had of this person maybe wasn't quite correct," or now that I know this person better, I'm seeing more aspects of them, more angles to their personality, and I like this person more than I thought. If attraction is the only thing that's bringing them together,
mm,
that's not very exciting on the page. Why can't they just walk off in the sunset immediately?
yeah, and you can tie that into the idea of stakes, right? Where there is some sort of once they're on their journey, there's something to win, but there's always also something to lose if they don't achieve their goal. And walking away is failure. So there's a big cost to walking away. I am a prior actor and newish writer here. I love storytelling and come up with countless ideas, but then I doubt my stories and often have trouble finishing them. Any tips, Lee?
Yeah. Well, one tip is that there's 2 places in every book project that you hit roadblocks. One of them is shortly after you start it, when the honeymoon phase is over. This wonderful big idea suddenly looks like it's going to be a lot of work. But the other one is about 3/4 of the way through, and that is the point at which you've invested way too much time to quit, but it seems like you don't have enough story to finish, or you have too much story to finish, or you don't know how you're gonna get from here to there. And it's not at all untypical to run across those 2. I think in my 100 books, I've had 1 maybe that I didn't actually hit those spots. So, a lot of times when you just push on through, it's a good time to stop, brainstorm, break down some walls, think about outside the box. How can you make things worse? How can you raise the stakes for this character? How can you make this problem worse? Not just giving them a new problem, but how can you make this problem worse? And sometimes it also helps to go ahead and write the ending, at least in an outline form, and then you know exactly where you're headed.
Another question, does the importance of two people being together in the end need to be something external and obvious, like being good parents or something contractual? Or can it simply be an internal reason, like longing or being fed up with loneliness?
As long it can be an internal reason like longing or being fed up with loneliness, as long as this is the right person. There are many things worse than being alone.
Hmm.
One of them is being with the wrong person. And so if someone is having a happy ending just to not be lonely, that's not really a happy ending. If they have found the right person and have overcome their loneliness because this person completes them and makes them better, they would be perfectly fine alone even if they were a bit lonely. But
Hmm.
this person makes them a fuller, better, more well rounded individual, then it's much more believable.
That's interesting because it's like the wrong person is just almost a band-aid, right? Not addressing the root
Exactly,
issue.
and it's certainly not a happy ending because that wrong person won't be the it won't be any better in 6 months or a year or 10 years than it is right now.
Leigh, do you want to end with any words of advice or wisdom for the writers who have shown up today?
Just keep writing. The only way to make it to the end is to just keep writing and rewriting.
Awesome. Awesome. That's that's true. It's right there. That's the only thing that makes you a writer is writing.
That's right.
So yeah, that's great.